Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where it's time for my weekend reading report. My weekend reading report. Roger has joined me as usual to talk about all the stuff I read last week and some of the stuff I'm going to be reading in the future, and a couple of things that just kind of showed up here at the manor. You know, this'll happen. Stuff just sort of shows up. So, what did I read this past week? Well, we are in the midst of Horror Mayhem right now. Horror Mayhem, a reading event created by the Bookish Bryants, devoted to reading horror fiction, specifically shorter stuff, 250 pages or less for a novel or short stories, stuff like that. And the first thing I read kind of broke those rules, but I started it last month, so it's okay. So the first book I finished reading was Pet Sematary by Stephen King. One of my favorite, well, it is my favorite Stephen King novel. And I haven't read this for a while, and it really held up. This book is great. This is a great Stephen King horror novel. Everything you want in a horror novel is in this book. Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So for my 500 book challenge, the challenge where I'm reading 500 books before I will buy any new ones. This is book number 40. Book number 40. I suck. So, Criminale and Another Bibliophile Reads both went over 100 before I got to 40. That's how slow I am. That's okay, you know. I won't look too much worse than Roger by the time that the challenge is finished. Really enjoyed this one. I'm going to do its own review, all the Stephen King books I read. I'll be doing individual reviews for, as I have in the past. I am reading every book by Stephen King, more or less in publication order. So this is what I was at, Pet Sematary, so I read that. Then I followed that up with the selection for this month for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, every month for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, we'll read a book that's available for free in the public domain. And this month's book this month's book is The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen, the great Welsh horror writer Arthur Machen. Best known for the short story, The Great God Pan. And he wrote The Three Impostors, which is an episodic novel, a short episodic novel, so it's perfect for Horror Mayhem. Full of ghastly, horrific, and weird stuff. This is another book I'll be talking about in its own video at the end of the month, like I do for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club picks. I did enjoy it a lot. I can see it's episodic, and there's an overarching story, and in the midst of that, there are a bunch of little stories, shorter stories, and some of those short stories have been cut out of the book and have been anthologized in different anthologies over the years. It's understandable why they picked the ones that they did, because those are the best in the novel. The quality of those individual episodes kind of goes up and down, but they're all good. Some of them are just really good. It does rely, this novel, on a startling amount of coincidence for anything to work. I mean, The Great God Pan was kind of like that too, but The Three Impostors really is. I mean, it's strange credulity to a certain amount, a lot actually, to imagine that, you know, our characters would keep running into the characters that they needed to run into, and to run into these situations they absolutely needed to run into in order for the story to work. So yeah, coincidence plays a huge part in this story. But it's so weird and ghastly and strange, it doesn't really matter. The Three Impostors, really, really loved it. It's really an interesting, short little book. If you ever get the chance, you should read it. Still plenty of time this month to read The Three Impostors for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. So that was book number 41. on the 500 book challenge. Then back to Stephen King for the Read Every Book by Stephen King that I'm doing. And that was this short little book, another one that was perfect for Horror Mayhem. Cycle of the Werewolf by Stephen King. Now this has illustrations by Bernie Wrightson. The great horror artist Bernie Wrightson. He's just an amazing artist. And he was also the co-creator of Swamp Thing, one of my favorite comic book characters. Of course, the Swamp Thing is one of my favorite comic book characters. He's real good at drawing werewolves, and that's what this story is about. So basically, it's basically a short story with a bunch of pictures by Bernie Wrightson in it. It started off as Existence, I believe, if I'm remembering right, as a calendar. They were going to do a calendar where Bernie Wrightson did the illustrations and Stephen King would write text. But that evolved into this little book. I'm glad it did. It makes a better book than a calendar, but it has, every month, it'll have a little episode, usually where somebody is killed by this werewolf. And the story goes on from there, month after month during the full moon. So it's a year of a werewolf terrorizing this little town. And the mystery is, okay, who is the werewolf? And there's a protagonist that shows up that eventually confronts the werewolf. So you have these little monthly episodes. And it's good, although I think Stephen King was hampered a bit by the format. Stephen King, he loves to go on his long digressions in his stories, detailing the backgrounds of all the various characters and all kinds of stuff. And I used to not like that when I was younger, although now as I've been rereading Stephen King's stuff and reading some of his stuff for the first time, I'm really enjoying that bit of his fiction. None of that is in here because he doesn't have any room. He has to get straight to the point. And I actually think that kind of works against this story. I think this story, if he had expanded it into an actual novel, would have been a pretty good werewolf novel. As it is, it's a good werewolf story. But the best part by far of this book are the illustrations by Bernie Wrightson. I mean, that is the best thing in this book. And definitely the illustrations alone make this worth picking up and reading. And like I said, it's a perfect choice for Horror Mayhem. It's the perfect length. It's the perfect subject matter. Werewolves. You can't go wrong with werewolves, really. So this was fun. And this was book number 42. It's book number 42. So there you go. Had a couple short books this month, so that's helpful for my challenge. So then I stepped away from Horror Mayhem for a bit because I have to get back to the Edgar Rice Burroughs deep dive, where I'm reading all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' books in order of publication, more or less. And I'm on this one right now. I'm reading The Son of Tarzan. This is the one with the great Neil Adams cover, the copy that I'm reading. It's fantastic. The Son of Tarzan, much different than the Son of Tarzan you might be familiar with if you watch those old movies. I know nobody does anymore, but there was a Son of Tarzan in the old movies, and he was just named Boy, and they found him in a plane crash or something, Tarzan and Jane. They had him in the more traditional manner in the novel, and he grows up. He grows up in the jungle. Through circumstances, he ends up in the jungle with an ape who was an old friend of his father's. And his son, John Clayton, grows up to be Korak the killer. And he is a killer too. This he's a killer, man. He just killed somebody for no reason, basically. Great book. This has always been one of my favorite Tarzan novels. In the Tarzan series at this time with Edgar Rice Burroughs, this was still early. This was the 4th book. And people were clamoring for more Tarzan stories. And Edgar Rice Burroughs at this point wasn't really sure how to go on with the character. And so he did what he did in the Mars series, where basically he took the protagonist's son and made a story about him, which Edgar Rice Burroughs had just done with John Carter's son, Carthoris, in Thuvia of Mars. in the Mars series. He does get back to Korak a couple times later on in the series, but after this he shifts back to Tarzan. And a couple books after this, he starts figuring out how he's going to continue the series. But these early days in the Tarzan series are interesting, with him just trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to continue this series? And this is a really interesting one, The Son of Tarzan. I remember really liking this the last time I read it, and I'm enjoying it very much right now. So I'm reading this. So in the future, after I read The Son of Tarzan, I'm going to go back to something for Horror Mayhem, but I haven't decided what yet, so I can't tell you. I'll let you know next week. As for the future of Edgar Rice Burroughs, the next Edgar Rice Burroughs book I'm going to read for the deep dive is this one, The Man-Eater by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which is another little book. So The Man-Eater is the next one for Edgar Rice Burroughs. And for Stephen King, I checked, and the next Stephen King book I'm going to be reading will be The Talisman, which is by Stephen King and Peter Straub. I've read a lot of and seen a lot of mixed reaction to this book. Some people say it's great. Some people say it's boring. We'll see. We'll see what I think of it. I've never read this book. I've never read The Talisman. So this will be the next Stephen King book I read whenever I get to it. Also, I am still reading Superman every day for the Superman challenge. Every single day of my life I'm reading Superman. And this morning I just finished this. This is The Man of Steel Volume 3, which continues the revamp by John Byrne and Jerry Ordway and some others. This volume, the third volume, is interesting because at the end of it, it includes the graphic novel that was written by John Byrne, but illustrated by Curt Swan. It's called The Earth Stealers. Curt Swan was probably the greatest Superman artist of all time. He wrote Superman for decades until he was fired when John Byrne was hired to revamp Superman in the 80s. He still did a couple things, though, and he did this one-shot graphic novel written by John Byrne and inked by Jerry Ordway. It's interesting because he doesn't draw Superman as he usually did in all of those gazillion issues that he drew of Superman. He actually updates Superman's look to be more consistent with the Superman at the time, which I feel was unnecessary. The artwork itself, though, was really, really good. And Curt Swan seems to be one of those artists, you know, there's some comic book artists that over time, the quality of their art kind of diminishes in their later years sometimes. There are some artists like that. That never seems to have happened with Curt Swan. The artwork in this is just as good as anything else that he had ever done. And he never really seems to have diminished in quality all the years that he worked. So I'm glad they included that bit in here. So finish this. And so the next thing, I'm going to take a break from, I've got one more volume of The Man of Steel, John Byrne's revamp. I've got one more volume of this. But I'm going to take a break from that. And I'm going to go back in time to the Golden Age, because I've also got 7 Golden Age omnibus volumes. These are really, really big. Of the original Superman. So, yeah. So the Golden Age stuff. So, yeah, I'll be doing this, starting this tomorrow for my Superman reading every day. Couple comic books, actually a couple books came in the mail. First book I got too late to show you last week, in last week's weekend reading report. It's this book. What is this book? It's a mystery. Actually, it's just missing its dust jacket. But this is from David Wiley, the great and wonderful David Wiley sent me this. This is Again Dangerous Visions. 46 original stories edited by Harlan Ellison. So this is obviously the sequel to Dangerous Visions, a science fiction anthology that Harlan Ellison edited that had stories that at the time were considered kind of hardcore or risque or not the kind of thing you would normally read in a science fiction magazine. And so that was a very successful anthology. So this is the sequel to that. He was going to do a third one, but he never did, as far as I am aware. It was never released. But yeah, I don't think I've ever read Again Dangerous Visions, and I didn't have a copy, and I mentioned that at some point. And David Wiley sent me this. So thanks, David. That was completely awesome. Also, I did get a book. I did buy a book, but it's okay because it's a book by a booktuber. And part of the 500 book challenge is that you can support your friends. If your friends and fellow booktubers publish a book, you should be able to support them. And so that's one of the caveats. And my good friend Gareth Howells, who has the wonderful booktube channel Books, Songs, and Other Magic, wrote this book of poetry, Voices of the City, by Gareth Howells. And on the back it says, this is a poetry collection where all of the poems were written around a theme. These poems together make up the characters created for a fictional city. They represent all walks of life, all aspects of life, and all ages. The concept behind the book is to paint a portrait of a community's thoughts, concerns, fears, habits, and secrets through poetry. And I've glanced through it, and it's good. Gareth Howells has like immense talent in every area, apparently. He's also a musician and a songwriter. And his ability as a songwriter really shines through in his poetry collection, I think. Because from what I've read, they're really, really good. I mean, I have no idea about poetry. But from what I can see, this is really good. So, of course, I recommend Gareth Howells' Voices of the City if you're into poetry, because it seems to be a good poetry collection. I'm going to read the whole thing. I am. So, this was really cool to get. Congratulations, Gareth, on another book. He's written a few. You should check out Gareth Howells and buy all his books. You should do that. And check out his channel, Books, Songs, and Other Magic. It's a fantastic channel. Absolutely great. So, a couple other things came in, comic book things, and this is one that I'm really happy about. More Superman. I don't want to run out. I'm reading Superman every day. So this is Superman, the 85th Anniversary Collection. It's an anthology of Superman stories. It seems like every 5 years now, we're getting an anthology of Superman stories. We had the 75th Anniversary Anthology, the 80th Anniversary Anthology. Excuse my dog Zorro. He's having a dream. Are you dreaming, Zorro? He's fast asleep. Anyway, the 85th Anniversary Anthology is here, and it's a really good one. It includes a bunch of stories that haven't been included in the previous volumes, and it's divided up by age. So we've got the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. And officially now, DC, I guess, is considering the 80s and 90s as the Dark Age. That's what they call them, which is appropriate. And then I guess everything in the 21st century is the Modern Age. And so it has stories from all of those comic book ages. And a lot of them seem to be really good stories. It has the 3 Supermen from Krypton, which is one of my favorite Superman stories. It also, however, ends up on the stupid story where Superman reveals his secret identity, which is funny because earlier on in this volume, there's a story called Why Superman Has a Secret Identity. So it only points out how obnoxiously stupid it is that Superman reveals his secret identity at all. The artwork, however, in that story is fantastic by Ivan Reis. But the Brian Michael Bendis story... But otherwise, great book, it looks like. Also, every week, I get an Epic collection or two. This week, I only got one Epic collection. Slow week for Epic collections. This is The Avengers West Coast, California Screaming. Volume 6, stories from 1990 to 1992 for the Avengers West Coast. Or West Coast Avengers. I guess at this point, they were Avengers West Coast. Yeah. So that's cool, but I think that's it. I think that's all I got. So yeah, that's all. That's all for my weekend reading report this week. Do you have anything to add, Roger? Roger fell asleep during the comic book portion of my video here. He's not real into the comics. He's like, you know, most of my viewers. Wake up, Roger! Everybody's sleeping around this place. Okay, guys, we'll catch you next time.